Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My pleasure to welcome you once again. This time we are going to deal with the situation in Norway, and I have two most distinguished people joining me today. The first one is Professor Malcolm Langford. Malcolm is a professor of public law at the University of Oslo. He is the director of the Center on Experiential Legal Learning called CEL. Which is a Center of Excellence in Education, and he is the co-director of the Center on Law and Social Transformation at the University of Bergen. He's a lawyer and social scientist. His publications span human rights, international investment, international development, comparative constitutionalism, technology, and the politics of legal profession. And then we have Tobias Mahler with us, Professor Tobias Mahler, who is a professor of law at the University of Oslo at the Center for Computers and Law there. Tobias currently focuses on research related to the Signal project. Signal is a project that deals with security in the internet, governance and network analyzing the law is the long title. So it's about information security and law. He's a lawyer by profession. He has taught at the University of Oslo, the King's College London, Queen Mary College, Stockholm University, and Stavanger University, and has worked as a visiting fellow inter alia in Stanford and at the Max Planck Institute for Foreign and International Criminal Law in Freiburg in Germany. Tobias is by origin German, and as I'm very proud to say, a former student of mine. So we met many years ago when Tobias was still very young. In Hanover, because he was one of my very first master students there. So long time ago. Very proud to have you in this new role or different role here today. Thank you to both of you for coming. Perhaps Tobias, it would be wise to start with you, asking you about how it is to work as a German lawyer in the Norwegian academic system, and how this Norwegian academic / legal system as a whole looks like for a German lawyer.
Well, first of all, many thanks for having us in this show. This is really an interesting podcast series that you've created, and thanks a lot for inviting us. So in terms of the legal education here in Norway, it is a system where the three old law faculties in Oslo, Bergen, and Tromsø, they offer a 5 years master's program, which is the program that qualifies you to act as a lawyer. But then in recent years, also smaller universities have started offering bachelor programs in law. But then in order to fully qualify as a lawyer, you would have to switch to one of the three old law faculties, which is a challenging thing to do. And so after 5 years of law studies, of a master's, one would then start practicing. And practicing for a couple of years in order to actually work as a lawyer. And compared to Germany, it's much more integrated in the sense that when you start practicing, you're a junior lawyer, you're not fully qualified, but you're just working as any other junior lawyer in a firm. And then after some years, and I think you have to have 3 or 5 cases, I don't remember, in court, you will be fully qualified. So the change there is so there are no state exams like in Germany, and it's more a gradual evolution after you qualify as a lawyer. Mm-hmm. And in academia, it's well, actually, I must say I was a bit surprised at the relatively high number of foreigners at law faculties, at least in Oslo. I wasn't so much used to that from Germany, but here we had colleagues from Australia, like Malcolm and Lee Bygraven, and Italy, and so it was in a sense more international. And I think most of our international colleagues work more with international perspectives, which is of course challenging when you have a law school that does regular legal education for Norwegian law.
And how do you solve this then? Is it the foreigners mainly teaching in the master and postgraduate programs, and the Norwegians teaching the undergraduates, or?
I think it's a mix. In my case, I'm teaching IT law, so that's the 5th year or the LLM program, and it's all in English. For some of our colleagues who did the more international perspectives in civil law, they also were asked to do more of the teaching in the first years.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I know that Malcolm is also involved in much more in the first years of education,
Mm-hmm.
teaching. I'm not sure. Do you teach constitutional law, Malcolm?
Yeah, so I teach international law and some constitutional law in Norwegian, which was a special challenge for a foreigner.
Yeah, and interesting just to hear that. I mean, is the Norwegian Constitution available in English? So could you teach this in English? I mean, is there an official translation available of it? Could you teach it in English?
Yeah, so I do have an elective course previously where we covered the Norwegian Constitution in English. It's a strange document adopted in 1814 in Old Danish and has never really been updated. So actually the Constitution is not formally in Norwegian. So even Norwegians struggle to read it in their own language. But in the compulsory courses, I cover it in Norwegian. And then we also compare it to other constitutions.
So one of the, I mean, this is already something which is very interesting for a German speaker to see how interesting the language situation in Norway is already when it's, I mean, just Danish, Swedish, Norwegian, and so on, all of them used in a way in the legal, some of them at least constantly in the legal debate, but also when it comes to the faculty, that it's so common that the faculty is from all over the world, which is very different from the German-speaking countries. And I think it would be, I mean, I was the only non-German when I lived in Germany at the faculty, and there are some Germans now teaching in Vienna, but there is no one teaching Austrian law who doesn't have German as a mother tongue. And I think it would be very weird for most of my colleagues to, I don't know, to have an Italian or an Australian or a French teaching Austrian/German law. But that's not really an issue where you teach at the moment, correct? And
it is an issue and it's not an issue. I mean, there is a major debate in Norway, as in many other European countries, about the number of international lecturers. Mm-hmm. That debate tends to be particularly strong in law, humanities, and the social sciences, where language is very much connected to the discipline. At the same time, we've seen in Norway, many foreigners learn the language and come up to a level in which they can teach. Germans, such as Tobias, are quite quick to learn Norwegian, and partly because the Scandinavian languages have a Germanic background. Yeah. But there's 2 written versions in Norway, and there's lots of dialects, so there are lots of challenges for Germans as well. But I think it's also because I've also been employed at a German university, University of Mannheim. And I think there's a difference in the academic culture, or at least structure. It is less hierarchical, even though there is a strong hierarchy there. But it's a little bit more, it's a little flatter in its approach. And also positions began to be advertised across the universities in English from the early 2000s. And so there was an opening up to international competition, which has allowed foreigners to compete on equal grounds. And if a position demands teaching in Norwegian, for example, then you can also show that you can teach Norwegian through a trial lecture, for example.
I see. And was that a decision taken by the leading personnel of the universities, or is this an outcome of the more open-minded culture, or both?
It's part of the internationalization of the universities and the whole Bologna process that began, 20 or so years ago, but also because many had complained about appointment systems that favored insiders. And this particularly affected women. And so once you began to have a more transparent appointment system with advertising in Norwegian and English, you started to also attract foreigners as well as female applicants.
And the minimum requirement to apply successfully for a professorship would be a PhD plus a second book, or is there any standardized rule on this?
You usually start as an associate professor. So that means with a PhD, and a law degree, you can apply for an associate professorship. And then you can keep qualifying until you have written the second book or some equivalent, in which case you then become a full professor.
But so that also means that it's still an inside. I mean, the step from associate to full is still mainly for insiders then. So it's difficult to come into the system on a full professorship level then.
Yes. So you well, not necessarily. You would basically apply for a position which is either associate or full professor, depending on your qualifications. And then you will be put into one or the other category, and then you can keep qualifying if you haven't qualified to full professor from the beginning. And so in a sense, I would say it's an open system. And also the committees assessing candidates are usually quite international, or at least relatively broad. In my case, it was fully international. That's also because there are so few law faculties. So in order to avoid too much insider knowledge and favorites, it's just a more objective process. So quite often the committee is just consisting of people who don't even work at the faculty, and it's just administered by one person at the faculty.
Interesting. And how do the universities compete? I mean, what is the main difference between the three of them when it comes to the academic labor market, and when it comes to the students? Are there any traditional differences? Is Oslo, I don't know, the more fundamental law oriented, or or the more international one, or is it, or how do students decide where to go, and how do academics decide where to go?
I mean, in Norway, we have very few law faculties per population. When we compare it, for example, to Australia, where you've got 25 law faculties and 25 million people, we have in Norway 5 million people, but only 3 are law faculties. And the Norwegian law faculty goes back to in Oslo, goes back to the time of the Constitution. So, it's been here more than 200 years. So long traditions, and was traditionally regarded as the more conservative in teaching methods. It's also quite close to government powers, whether it's the courts, the executive, and the parliament. And many of our professors over time have been politicians and prime ministers and so forth. Bergen then came 60 or 70 years ago, and then Tromsø after that. Bergen was more experimental with teaching, and Tromsø provides a bit more expertise on issues that are relevant to the Arctic, for example. There's a lot of things happening in the Arctic with climate change, with use of natural resources, Sami indigenous rights, and so forth. What's happening now is interesting with these new centers of excellence and a whole range of other funding for pedagogical innovation, is the University of Oslo now has also begun to experiment and innovate in many areas. And as has the University of Tromsø, with more emphasis on procedure, use of mooting competitions in teaching, and so forth. So it's difficult to say what are the clear differences today. And now we're cooperating, all 3 law faculties, through CEL Norway, which we're setting up, so that we actually learn from each other and adopt each other's reforms as we go forward. So it's an exciting time, actually, right now for legal education in Norway.
Yeah, and legal education, as it looks like at the moment in Norway, is mainly online, right? Or only online, or I mean, how is it today?
Well, it depends really. So my courses in English are only online, but for the traditional Norwegian law teachings, there are some. I think which years are offered? Is it the first year, Malcolm? That is offered actually on campus?
So for the 5-year Master of Law that Tobias talked about, which you need to qualify as a legal advocate, we decided the first year would be partially physical and partially online to enable the students to actually have some feeling of the new university they've just joined. So they have all their lectures digital, but the courses and seminars are fully physical. Same for 4th year, because that's probably the hardest year. There's a very heavy course on criminal law that many struggle with. So that faculty also prioritized that year for physical course teaching. And then for the 2nd year, the 3rd year, the 5th year, and the international programs, you only get one course day physically. The rest of teaching is digital.
Yeah. And Tobias, in your case, the students are not even in Norway, right? I mean, many of them at least.
Well, yes, I'm teaching an LLM program, and my students were not even allowed into Norway. So the government just decided that they wouldn't give out visas for students. And then my students are somewhere between China and South America. So it's an issue also with time zones when we do teaching.
Yeah, and how do you teach then? Is it live online, you speaking and them responding, or?
It's a mixture. So we do pre-record some lectures, and then we have Zoom meetings like this one where we discuss with students.
Yeah,
and
and it works in your view. So students are happy and you are happy with the situation.
The semester just started a few weeks ago, so we are still experimenting, and we are still trying to find out some of the functions in Zoom which work differently from what you expect. And suddenly the breakout rooms don't work as you plan to, and all of these mistakes are still being committed as we speak. So I think it works to some degree, and we are really certainly in the learning process.
Yeah. And Malcolm, for you, this must be a kind of a dream, right? I mean, running a center for experiential learning and then having such a situation, that's, I mean, the best thing that can happen, right? So
I have been called Dr. Zoom many times. I've been working with Zoom for around 2 years. So the 12th of March, Norway closed down. That's when we went into a full lockdown. And in the next few days at CEL, including with Tobias and a digital course coordinator, we worked around the clock to develop digital resources for teachers. We held an introduction to Zoom on Sunday, the 15th of March for lecturers. We started a national Facebook group for all academic teachers in Norway, which now has almost 4,500 members, where academic teachers across Norway ask questions, they share advice. We've had more than 25 webinars and so forth. So in that sense, it was a dream in order to actually show the potential for online education, but it was perhaps not the most ideal way to do it in a crisis situation. But what we saw across Norway was basically academic teachers dropped everything, dropped research, and just threw themselves into it and really tried to master it. And we've done a number of evaluations of how that's gone, and the results are diverse.
Interestingly, if I see correctly, Zoom was not really under debate, right? So it was quite clear that you would use this, whereas in German and Austrian universities, there were clear issues when it came to the usage of Zoom, and at least in Vienna, for example, it's not really supported officially as one of the platforms to be used. Different in Norway, obviously.
Well, I think the university started purchasing Zoom half a year before Corona hit, which means that by the time Corona hit, it was ready, and they had done an assessment of the security aspects and ended up with an architecture where the Zoom servers that we use are situated in Denmark, I think. So then when the coronavirus situation hit us, the only thing we had to do was add more servers to the Zoom architecture, because there was so much more need for bandwidth, but otherwise everything was in place. So this is a consortium of universities that runs the servers, and then they collaborate with Zoom so that actually everything is going through the Zoom servers in Scandinavia. And then, of course, when the debates about Zoom started in the media, many teachers became concerned, and we had to go back and explain what had happened previously, and we had to get the assurances from the university's IT department that they had assessed the situation, that we were GDPR compliant, and then basically it just worked.
We basically had a Nordic solution to Zoom, and which meant we avoided many of the problems elsewhere. We did get Zoom bombed once. So that was an interesting experience. When I was leading a webinar, I had 2 university chancellors on a panel, and a Zoom bomber waited for 3 minutes until it started, and then had 7 different profiles and Zoom bombed the meeting. But we learned from that, and we also upgraded to Zoom webinar when we have public events and we publicize the Zoom link.
And Zoom is integrated in some kind of learning platform that is provided by each university. So, okay. And that is based on Moodle, or what do you use there as a platform?
We use Canvas.
Okay, I see. Okay.
And so then you can integrate, actually it's just links, but you can generate a Zoom room through Canvas.
Yeah, okay. And that works properly and everyone is happy. Yeah, okay.
Well, I think it works. It's still a learning curve for some of our colleagues, and including myself. Sometimes you make mistakes, you press the wrong button, and then it doesn't work as intended. But I think in general it works.
Yeah.
And just to give you an example, so when we did a survey of national teachers in late March, early April, we found that only 30% had ever done at least one lecture before wholly digitally, but now 80% use Zoom. So it was a sort of phenomenal transformation in terms of basic digital competences. But when we ask both students and lecturers what they think about the learning outcomes, then it varies dramatically. We see around 40% of students and teachers on average across many surveys saying that online education, despite the COVID-19 lockdown and all the restrictions, was actually the same or better than ordinary teaching. Around 40% saying it's a little bit worse, and then 20% saying it's much worse. So there's real different experiences of what online education can do. But also we see that students that received interactive online education and live, a bit like was Tobias was talking about, whether it's discussion, breakout rooms, a case study, working on particular questions, whatever it is, and it's also live, then those students reported often better learning outcomes. So that's what we see right now in the second semester of online teaching, is an attempt to try and make online education more active and more suitable for learning processes.
And do you teach the professors in how to achieve this, or is everyone trying his or her very best independently?
Partly. I mean, one of the things about teaching is it's largely privatized. So unlike in primary or secondary school, we basically employ people who've spent most of their lives researching something and writing books, and then we give them incredible power and responsibility to teach, and that's 50% of their job, but absolutely no training in how that should be done. Some universities have systems to try and ensure some basic pedagogical competences for professors. But I think what was interesting about the COVID-19 lockdown is everyone discovered that they had actually a need for more training, both on online education, but also perhaps interactive education. So we've seen an increase in demand for that. And there has been partly a supply. I mean, I named the Facebook group. Many universities and agencies have webinars and so forth. But I would say that we still don't have a really good system for ensuring that it's sufficient, that most professors have basic pedagogical competence, and it also improves over time and is updated with new developments.
But the Facebook group looks very much like a grassroots movement in a way, right? So exactly the opposite of what I would have expected in a way from university leadership in such a situation, right? But
yeah, university leadership. So we've been a bit critical. There was no real emergency plan in place. Universities, which are on the outskirts of Norway, in the mountains and the fjords, we're much better prepared because they've been doing much more online teaching. But the big old universities had to struggle to really ensure the infrastructure, soft and hard, on campus and off campus. Some academic leaders really rose to the occasion and provided real leadership. Others disappeared. But the Facebook group was a great environment where academic teachers could find each other, and they often trusted each other more. And that also came up in our survey. we found that they were more likely to ask a colleague than to ask a pedagogical expert or an IT expert, better or worse.
Yeah. Interesting. And do you systematically analyze whether there is any, for example, any relationship between student success and their and how content they are about the online teaching formats? Or about students' priorities or characters and so on, or is it just that you ask an overall question in how far they were happy with the outcome?
Well, I think success is probably more difficult to assess because in the Corona semester during the spring, our faculty adopted a policy whereby the only grades given were pass and fail. Mm-hmm. So, and in that situation, most students passed, and then it is, I don't know, did you try, Malcolm did lots of empirical studies there. Did you try and look at some correlations between passing grades and whether the students were content, Malcolm?
So there's two things there. So we did find that in some subjects, the failure rate increased. But one of the explanations for that is that more students actually took the exam because they thought it might be easier to pass with pass-fail, but didn't actually do the study. So there's that. And then the second thing is that we do have some major studies. For example, there's one with 10,000 students who've answered an evaluation at the University of Oslo. There's a big debate now as to whether we can link those answers to the grades that they've got in different subjects. Not sure, but hopefully this semester we'll design a new evaluation instrument that can precisely do that, link to grades, and produce what we now call as learning analytics in evaluation of education.
But there is no outcome yet that you could report for it. No, but for it, just let me show you one example. I mean, my very personal, not really scientifically validated experience so far is that online teaching makes it much easier to address introverts who are students, right? So normally they tend to not talk in a physical class, and it's much easier for them to interact using a chat functionality or something like this. And I have it just as my gut feeling at the moment, and I would really appreciate to have some kind of hard figures about this, but they are not available yet, are they?
What we see across the education sector, primary, secondary, and tertiary, is that there's a large group of students who thrive with complete online education. My daughter, for her it was great. She could concentrate on her schoolwork without being distracted so much. But she also missed the classroom environment. But we see that in all of our studies that there's a clear group of students who thinks that online education is much better than ordinary education. And I think that's one of the clear results of COVID-19 is to help us to understand that students are different. They need different types of teaching methods and different types of assessment methods. And therefore we should vary both in order that all students receive a teaching and assessment offer that at times suits them particularly, and doesn't just suit one particular type of student.
Yeah. Let's talk perhaps a little bit, if you don't mind, about the assessment system in Norway. So how are grades normally achieved? Is it the German way of solving cases in a limited time, or is it more writing academic papers or papers that are similar to academic papers, or is it a mixture of both? And or is it oral examinations? And how did all this change now?
Well, it used to be very much similar to Germany, where you had cases that needed to be solved. But then a few years ago, at least at our faculty, there was a process assessing whether it would be possible to do something else. And there was a committee, and the committee recommended to open up the system and say, well, now we can have different types of exams. We started introducing more term papers first, so only term papers being written throughout the semester, and often with quite a bit of choice for the students what to write on. So discuss questions related to something, and then you fill in the blanks and you write a rather individual thesis-like paper. And then we also started some reforms. So, for example, I teach a course on robot regulation now, where the exam is that a group of students has to create a film on robots and how they should be regulated. And then they submit a 30 minutes film, which is assessed by the teachers with a group grade. And then there is an oral exam where we watch the film and discuss. So those things have become possible, and it's really a different way of teaching and assessing the students, but one that I think is also fun, at least for us.
Yeah. I mean, it's completely unthinkable under the German system that a lawyer might become a lawyer by producing a film in a group and then discussing the income, and that's really interesting. So I would assume that this tendency has now even increased, right, and become more important, because it's difficult to ask students to solve cases in an online environment, right?
Well, actually, this was a bit inspired by the German seminar tradition, where you, as a student, at least when I was a student, I gave a presentation and had a paper. So then it's just a group presentation and still the individual paper. And then from there on, from the group presentation, why not do a film? And then, so what the students actually first do is they give a presentation without a grade, and then they work further with that presentation, create a film on the base of that presentation, and submit the film.
Yeah.
It's actually now part of a sort of systematic work where we've had a lot of experiments in the elective subjects, and we're taking them over to the compulsory subjects. So you have a class like Tobias where they make a film. I've been course coordinator for a subject called Legal Technology, Artificial Intelligence in the Law. And there the exam is a group project where you develop a prototype for a new form of legal technology. For example, a bot to help you calculate how much inheritance you get and so forth. We have another subject where you actually write legislation, where you basically get a mandate, for example, from a government department or a local municipality to consider a new law on a topic. So, for example, one of the groups got a request from the Oslo municipality on how do we regulate electric scooters. So they had to do like a public commission report in the same way it's done by a government panel, and then come up with a proposal for new legislation or new regulations on how things are done. And then what we're doing in 5 areas, particularly these sort of experiential or experience-based learning methods that test your oral skills, your written skills, digital, practical, and dispute resolution, integrate that in the compulsory subjects. So I've done that, for example, in international law in 2nd year, where you actually have to do a moot, before the International Court of Justice. And that's actually not graded, but you have to pass it in order to take the exam. And what we've found is that students put a lot of effort into that and actually start reading the judgments of the International Court of Justice for the first time, and not just the textbook. And so that's part of the sort of the transformation that we're looking at. And some of these things can also be graded. Perhaps in the future, that moot before the International Court of Justice will actually get a grade that you'll have on your CV.
And that's also true for the very fundamental first-year subjects, like, I don't know, constitutional law or private law, that approach?
Yeah, and in fact, in private law, there's been, we've actually cancelled grades for the first semester, so that students can really focus on developing their basic legal skills, their writing skills, how they work in groups. The moot now in 2nd year has been expanded from international law to increasingly include constitutional law and international human rights. So there's a gradual expansion into new fields as we go along. In contract law now, there will be a new exercise from next year where you have to negotiate a contract. I'm not sure if, like me, like you, I saw an actual contract when I studied contract law in Australia. It's been the same here. But now you have to draft one with 2 groups of students with an exercise. You get the experience of seeing and drafting a contract, but you'll also learn more deeply about contract law because the issues you have to struggle with are actually related to theory.
And do you think that your fellow colleagues support this development, or is it something that they need to do, or that they think that they need to do because of COVID?
No, actually, these developments precede COVID-19. So that has been happening over many years. So we've seen digitalization in teaching. So we've done podcasts of all our lectures. All our lecture halls have podcasting facilities. And then these new developments in terms of different teaching styles are introduced by individuals who really want to try out something new. And well, I think most of our colleagues are perhaps first a bit reluctant, but then when they see that it's actually possible to do that and that you can achieve at least the same with these methods, then perhaps you can convince them to also try out something new. So I think, in a sense, we are in a situation where a lot of development is going on, and where new things are possible that were unthinkable a few years ago, and that was in place already when the corona situation hit us.
And you would expect that the outcome of all this will be that not everything will be brought back to the status quo ante when corona is over, right? So there is some development in this, because I think in many of the universities in my environment that I see, many of the colleagues that I see there, as far as I see it, have the feeling that they need to survive 1 or 2 or 3 exceptional semesters, and then everything will be just like before, and that is what they want. But what you tell me here sounds a little bit different.
I mean, there are some people who said back in March that we've had 15 years development in pedagogy in 1 month, you know, in terms of the IT side of things. But there's a major debate in Norway amongst academic teachers. How much should we take with us into the future? But where you see broad consensus is flipped classroom, which is what Tobias talked about earlier, where you do a pre-record of the more theoretical aspects of your teacher, and then use more class time to go in depth, to have more interaction. And almost all academic teachers understand, well, that saves time, it's more effective, but I also can get more direct contact with students. So I think that's one area we'll see continuing. But also I think that Corona has forced us to think about how we teach. It's sort of a bit of a shock to the system. And so I think we can also see perhaps a greater openness amongst a broader group of academic teachers. But that being said, like in Germany, there's lots of academic teachers who would like to go back tomorrow to how things were. So it's a divided profession, to say it like that. But one thing we do have in Norway is these centres of excellence, and also smaller pots of funding for interactive teaching, digitalisation of teaching. It's possible to apply for money to start these projects. And that means also being able to give finances to your colleagues who may be a bit skeptical, to say, look, here you get 20, 30 extra hours in your teaching bank to try something new. Here's the money, here's some resources, here's some teaching assistants. So that's also helping change the system and trying to put education on the same level as research.
Yeah, which is probably not the case yet, right? So it's quite like everywhere else that you should be excellent in research, and that's decisive for your career, and teaching is a nice to have, but not more, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes.
And then we had a legal change also, going back to what Tobias was talking about with promotion to being a professor. Yes, it's 2 times the PhD that you need to have. Actually 3 times if you're in the social sciences or natural sciences. But now it's also your teaching competences. And that's part of the application for a professorship. You have to have a big folder showing all the teaching you've done, how you've sought to improve yourself, and so forth.
And that has a role in the selection process?
Well, it has a role in whether you go from associate professor to professor, but it can also have a role now in when you apply to be an associate professor. So if there's 2 candidates who are equally excellent on research, then the candidate that has more teaching experience will be clearly preferred. But even if there's one who's just a little bit better on research, We're seeing now in quite a few appointment processes, if you are very strong in education, you can actually jump over that candidate. And that often comes out in the trial lecture.
So everything that you said is true for the German situation, apart from the very last sentence. So I've not seen, or I do not remember very many cases where excellence in teaching then was used as a substitute for some weaknesses in research. So it's if two are, I mean, if there were the theoretical situation that two are really equal in research, that might play a role. But in the moment, one of them is stronger in research. That is the decisive factor here.
That was in Norway, but we see it changing in multiple appointment processes. Sometimes it's a bit questionable because it increases the subjective element there. So there's been debate around some appointments where they've changed the ranking based on the trial lecture and educational experiences. But others have been, the students have been very, very clear that we want that professor who was ranked 2 from an educational perspective, and the students have carried the day. Students participate also in these processes, both formally and informally.
Yeah. Perhaps let's go back once again to the student situation. Are there any concerns about the legal implications of all these changes in the educational system when it comes to surveillance, data protection, privacy, copyright, etc.? Or is this, I mean, is there so much chaos that nobody really thinks about the consequences so far?
Well, we've had some discussions about data privacy and security in terms of the use of Zoom. So as I mentioned, we started podcasting a few years ago in the lecture halls, but the cameras were set up in a way that they wouldn't pick up the student faces, and the microphones would only pick up the lecturer. So in practice, I always had to repeat the question so that it would be on the record. Now, when you record something in Zoom, then you have a different situation. So then the situation, and we actually had the default that all the lectures were recorded when they were held in the lecture halls, because it was so easy to press the record button that eventually most colleagues did. On Zoom, it was more challenging. So when you have a lot of interaction with students, should you then record? What part of the session should you record? And but we also have IT people who can help us. So I ended up with a bad recording a few weeks ago where student faces showed up, and then we just got rid of them on the video before we put. So this is an issue, and there is also this balance between, on the one hand, you could tell all the students don't switch on your cameras, but then you sit in front of a black screen and you don't. With breakout rooms, because then students switch on their cameras and being in a sense off.
And I mean, one of the issues many of my colleagues complain about here is that students do not switch on their camera, and they are very reluctant in being visible on any video platform, which is, as if I understand you correctly, the same in Norway, right? In principle, well, at least, if you are in a plenary session, you are standing in front of a black screen.
Well, I think it really depends. This semester, well, last semester that turned out to be the case in some of the lectures where students didn't know each other from before. In my lectures, I just said, well, you all switch on your cameras, let's talk to each other. And that was okay. And then this semester, I started out with a message to the students in advance, telling them why I want them to have their cameras on. And then I started with a breakout session where they should say hello to each other, which is when they have to switch on their cameras anyway. And then when they come back to the main room in Zoom, then the cameras are on and we can talk to each other.
Yeah.
And so one of the things about CEL is we also have student leaders in our organization. So there's actually a student co-director with me. There's a student leader in every pillar. For example, Tobias has a student leader in his digital pillar. And they actually launched a campaign last semester asking students to turn the camera on, no more black faces on the camera. So but it is a challenge from a privacy perspective as we go forward.
Yeah, indeed. And there are so many other privacy challenges in the situation since March. Malcolm, you wrote a blog article that I read in preparation of this conversation, which gave me an excellent overview about the fundamental rights implication, not only at the university, but for the whole society in Norway since March 2012 of this year. Would you kindly condense this shortly and give an overview about what the situation is on a general level in Norway at the moment?
Yeah, so 12th of March, the country closed down, and within a day or two, a proposal was developed for emergency power bills, amongst other things, which would basically be a state of emergency where the government would have extensive powers to pass legislation without the approval of the parliament over the period of a year. But parliament, if a third of parliament objected to a particular rule or essentially new law by the executive, then it could be overturned. There was a massive pushback, including by many law professors at this faculty and other faculties, to this. And we got an amended corona law, as it was called, which only went for 1 month and was more limited in what the executive could do and more subject to judicial review powers. It was extended for a further month and then it finished in late May. So there's been a major debate around what the government can do. There were also, for example, everyone was banned from going to their cabins in the first few months of the corona lockdown. And, if you're talking about Norwegians and fundamental rights, then the cabin is core to the Norwegian identity, being up in the mountains or on the fjord. But like other countries, we've had also other issues where different measures by the government have had direct and indirect impact on human rights and the rule of law. Asylum seekers, for example, have particularly struggled to get their cases heard or even come to the country. Children have been particularly neglected, or vulnerable children. Schools were closed. All the health sisters who worked in schools had to work with infection rather than following up children. And then, as we talk about in the blog with Christine Sundvik, who's a colleague of Tobias and myself, is the Smith to Stop app. So these sort of tracking applications that try and help the health authorities determine who's been potentially affected, who have you been in proximity to, so they can actually do the tracing much more effectively. We could talk for a long time about the process of the development of this tracking app in terms of tendering processes, involvement of the private sector, and so forth. But they launched the app and they encouraged everybody to download it, and millions of Norwegians did. But then it's been recently stopped in its tracks because there was a whole lot of issues precisely around privacy.
And the usage was based on informed consent. So there was no law asking the citizens to install the app?
Well, it was consent, but then there was also a local regulation that was the legal basis. But the issue was that it was, in a sense, a double consent, both to be tracked for the purposes of finding out who you have been in contact with, and also a general permission to do research. And it was not possible to say, I only want to be tracked for the purposes of finding out who the more specifics of the infection, and not the general tracking. And then it was also centrally stored. All the data were centrally stored, and there were. It was a general lack of privacy by design, and lack of options for everyone.
And this was developed by the government, or was it a private player?
Well, Malcolm, probably you know more about the details. It was a research institute collaborating with other private actors and the what do you call Folkehelseinstituttet in Norway in English, Malcolm? The health
Public Health
Directorate.
Institute.
Public Health Institute.
Government institute. Yeah.
And it's completely stopped now, so it's not used anymore. The whole system, and the data is deleted, or the data is stored somewhere waiting for reuse, or.
I think the data is deleted. Yes, they deleted it immediately after they got a notice from the data inspectorate saying that this is illegal and you have to stop it.
Or the data inspectorate, sorry to intervene, is the Data Protection Authority,
yes,
right?
The Data Protection Authority said that we are starting an investigation, and it looks like what you're doing here is illegal under Norwegian law, GDPR, and then they basically just deleted all the data that had been collected and stopped collecting it.
And that was not contested in public debate. I mean, it
was contested, but at the same time, I think it's still an ongoing situation, because I haven't heard much about it in recent weeks. But I think the idea was to just delete all the data for now and then come back with an improved version of the app. But that hasn't happened so far. Malcolm, you have any more recent information about that?
What's happening? I also noted that the major multinationals, was it Apple and Google, are also pushing their tracking apps as we go. And instead, we've seen a massive increase in employment of human tracers throughout the municipalities with the second wave of corona that we're experiencing now. But it was an interesting moment, because in the sense that there were many people who would be concerned with privacy issues, supported having this tracing app. I mean, a lot of people wrote on social media, it's it's our duty to download it after considering the issues. So it shows that in a crisis that we can quickly put aside privacy concerns, and sometimes that's important. But I think that's one thing we can learn, is we perhaps need to take a second round on how much of privacy rights we wish to put aside in the midst of emergency.
Yeah, that's very interesting what you say. But still, I think if I understood you correctly, the situation in Norway is still very positive, in the sense that academia was very active, that the parliament was very active. So compared with other countries, this looks very much like a very rational approach, and an approach that is very much driven by the rule of law and some fundamental democratic principles. So is there any major thing you would criticize, Malcolm? Any major error that happened then?
I mean, I think in many of the positive things that happened through democratic processes, where people actually push back against certain tendencies to overreact. Because the Norwegian welfare state and system, it's a strongly centralized system, and there's incredible trust in the government generally. I mean, Scandinavian countries have the highest levels of trust. So the conditions were very ripe for very, very intrusive forms of regulation. If you look at some of our pandemic laws, they're the strictest in the world, alongside Japan, which have been developed in previous pandemics. But I think there was a pushback from below on certain things, and then the government and parliament have adjusted, and I think that's what they can be praised for, including the Smith to Stop tracing app. In the end, they dropped it. In Finland, actually, they've continued with it, and it's been extensively rolled out.
Yeah, and in many other countries.
Name some areas. I think it's more vulnerable groups who have less of a voice. Asylum seekers, migrants, children, and vulnerable children, and so forth. These groups have perhaps been less heard than others.
Interesting. So, I mean, just to bring this on the table, when you look into the situation in Germany or in Austria, we also have all the issues with the apps, but nobody would have ever dared to really fully stop the whole system. I think, I mean, politically, that would have been impossible, even if it were from a legal standpoint the right way to go. I don't think that any of the authorities ever thought about that seriously. Very interesting, very interesting. And now the situation is that this preliminary law that was in force until end of May, I think, is no longer enforced. So everything is back to normal.
Partly and partly not, in the sense that many of those provisions have been now taken over into normal laws.
Mm-hmm.
So that and for example, when it came to courts, a whole lot of emergency provisions had to be written so that courts could function online. Because a lot of the criminal process and civil process laws presume, physical court proceedings, and so. But some of those, as I understand, provisions have been now continued so that courts can continue to function partly digitally, but they've also partly moved back physically. Mm-hmm. We have a project now with the Norwegian court administration where we're looking also to develop a more sustainable digital courtroom. It's a project we actually started before COVID-19 a year ago. We developed a prototype just before the COVID-19 lockdown. And we're now just employing a developer so that we can have digital courtrooms that actually function well. I mean, Zoom is okay for a digital trial, but there's lots of things you would want that Zoom doesn't have. For example, the ability to speak with your client without everybody else hearing. I can't speak to Tobias right now without you, Nicholas, hearing. Yeah. So they're the sorts of things that we're developing, integrating case management and documents into an online digital system. But then we also learn from what works and doesn't work with digitalization of courtrooms. For example, one of the things we're seeing is that perhaps key witnesses need to be held physically because body language is key to that. But perhaps you don't need to have the advocates in the room. That's less important. So I think going forward, there's a lot to learn from the Corona period. We're about to do a survey of judges and how they experienced it, and how we design new technologies for legal proceedings.
Yeah, and there's plenty of research ongoing as far as I see in Norway, which is really, really a positive and good sign to see how advanced the academic situation there is already. I really appreciate this. Because the problems are obviously not only relevant in Norway, they are relevant everywhere, but Norway looks very much like being in the lead or one of the leaders when it comes to the academic support of all these developments. Would you share this impression?
In some areas we're in the lead, and perhaps because we can see that, but we also see that some areas we were very much behind and had to do a catch up. I mean, for example, there's universities in the US like Texas, in Austin, which have been doing fantastic online teaching for the last 5 years. With they've got 7 teaching assistants in the room. There's 3,000 students participating. I mean, so in a global perspective, we can't say that we're leading, but I think in a European perspective, we've been able to catch up fairly quickly, and perhaps because we're a small country, a little bit more egalitarian. We're a very digitalized country, and we have the most digital, financial transactions in the world. That has been a little bit more easy for us to adapt to this new environment. Yeah,
and Tobias, I assume that this is also very good news for you because of your center, right? I mean, the Oslo Center for Computers and Law is one of the oldest in the world, and I would assume that the situation and the visibility of your center has significantly increased since March. Is this true?
Sorry, my internet connection just
but you're back.
Somehow quit.
Yeah. Could you hear my question?
I'll try to be back in a moment.
No worries, Tobias. No worries.
Half of it.
Could you? The question is whether the situation.
It looks better now.
Okay, perfect. So the question was in how far your center for computers and law at University of Oslo has increased in its visibility and in its impact since March. I would assume that this was, I mean, you are one of those winning out of the crisis, aren't you? Okay, gone again. Pity, Malcolm.
That's one of the challenges
not necessarily.
Of digital communication.
Yeah.
I live on a farm just south of Oslo where I've done teaching from my car because they don't have proper internet connection.
All of us end up in such situations. Yeah. Tobias, are you back? Are you back? I can see you at least. Can you hear us?
I'm back.
Yeah, good. So
I
not
can
necessarily
hear
you
yes.
said, right?
Am I back?
Yeah, you are.
Well,
you
not
are.
necessarily, because in a sense, it's also about visibility. So when Malcolm talked about the Facebook group, many of our colleagues are not on Facebook, so they were not visible at all in some of these developments. So it's although a lot of digitization was happening at all levels, it was also new people at the faculty who were taking on new roles and becoming more active. And just the fact that someone teaches IT law doesn't necessarily mean that you know which button to press on Zoom necessarily, or want to spend time on finding out exactly the answer to that question.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true. Wow, that was now.
But
Go.
In a sense, it was a pity because. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Well, we were just about to celebrate our 50th anniversary when Corona hit, and that had to be cancelled.
And that's, I mean, that's unbelievable. So 50 years of computers and law department. I mean, is it the oldest in the world?
Second oldest.
It is the second oldest. The Swedes beat us by half a year or a year.
Okay. Yeah. So,
but at the same time, we moved to new offices, which are very nice, very beautiful, as you can see. But not perfect internet connection in all of the rooms. As you can experience right now.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Malcolm and Tobias. Is there anything that you would like to add? Anything that I should have asked you?
I'd just like to say it's been wonderful actually to talk across borders about these issues, about legal education and legal systems in a European context. And I think that's what COVID-19 and digitalisation has also given us. We've been able to talk across university boundaries in Norway about how we teach, but now this is the second conversation I've had with European colleagues in law faculties in the last week, and about, for example, how we teach, and particularly how we teach law. So I really hope that this continues and we start to build a European consciousness and global consciousness and networks in the teaching of a very national discipline, which is law.
True, yeah. Tobias, I mean, one of the good points we can make is we have been trying to do this in a way. Yeah.
Exactly, and just congratulations on your. It was wonderful to see all the progress, not just Europe, South Africa and other places. I think this sort of global conversation which you are very much a part of is just fun.
Yeah. Tobias, do you still want to add something? I don't know whether it was again the internet issue or me interrupting you.
No, I think given the difficulties with my internet connection, I'll refrain from final comments.
Okay. So then, thank you so much.
Everything is perfect in Norway.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. I very much appreciate this. I will put it online very quickly. Thank you to our listeners for joining us. Have a good week and all the best to all of you. And bye-bye.
Thanks very much, Nicholas. Thanks for the invitation.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.